You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 118. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Today, Sarah and I want to continue our conversation about leading through storms.
Before we do, let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/118. You'll also find links to your favorite podcast player on the show notes page so that you can hit that subscribe button and join us and know when a new episode drops.
So as we've been talking about storms, we've been focused upon a scripture in Matthew's gospel. It's Matthew 8:23 through 27. And I'll just remind you of that scripture right now. Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him saying, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. Today we want to talk about how your values guide your behavior. So stick with me for a second, because the values and the behavior we want to talk about today is pausing. If you're in a storm, one of the things most of us don't do is to stop, is to pause.
Yeah, that's really true. So let me ask you something. You being, if you're listening to this, I'm asking this question of you. When was the last time you paused and you didn't fall asleep? Maybe it's just me, but most of the time there is only one gear, and it's go. But as a person of faith and as a leader in the faith community, what I know is in God we find a rhythm. We find a pattern. We find this word that we call Sabbath. We find something that's called rest. We see Jesus in the scriptures over and over going off on his own to pray. Now, this isn't a guilt trip or a shame storm. I simply want you to consider, if faith is important to you, that would be a value. The behavior around that value and how that value, one of the ways that that value can be exhibited is by learning to pause, to rest, to be still, even in the midst of a storm.
It sounds interesting to me. So what's the value behind pausing?
Well, we probably could say it lots of different ways, but I would say it as faith or faithfulness. You might also say trust, but we're going to talk about that one on a future episode. So I'm going to leave it as faith or faithfulness.
Preparing for this, you and I had a brief conversation, and maybe you'll remind people that you realized this in a hard way earlier this year, didn't you?
This is one of those lessons that I seem to not learn real quickly because I have to learn it over and over and over again through hard moments that I'm being reminded to hit the pause button. I'm avoiding answering your question. Yes. So earlier this year, I was in the midst of, it was probably 3 weeks straight of working every single day. And we came to Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and I just said, I'm taking Monday off. I'm not working. Now, let me be clear about something here. I created that 3 weeks of craziness. I created that 3-week storm. I had too many things on my calendar in a short period of time. And so it was go, 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 go. But what I was reminded of the day after I finally paused is I had a whole different perspective when another storm came rushing in, changing my plans for the day. I couldn't and wouldn't have remained calm and even laughed about it or chalked it up to learning if I hadn't paused. And so for me, that moment was a reminder that in the midst of the storms, we need to rest. It's the last thing that we naturally think about doing or want to do, but it's the very thing that we need to be able to reset. And I don't think that I think that there is a reason that we see a rhythm in Scripture of 6 days work, 1 day rest. I'm not good at it, folks. Hear me loud and clear. I am still working towards that, but I know the importance of it.
So, Sarah, I saw that in this storm that we're in right now, this with the pandemic. I saw that in a way that really encouraged me, and that is, and this is not anything political, it's just my perspective of something that I experienced. Dr. Acton was not present for several days on the press conference. And I think even the governor was getting emails and wondering, what happened to Dr. Acton. The next day she's on, she said, I had to step away. She didn't use the word pause, but she said I needed to step away to get a different perspective.
Yeah.
And it was being able to look at it from a different view. And so I think that's what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah,
Be able to step away and look at it differently.
Maybe I translated it in my head to rest, but I think she alluded to she needed time to rest because she had been going. And earlier in the week, the lieutenant governor had taken a couple of days. And at the end of the week, she took a couple of days. And I'm glad that you brought that example up. Now, this is for our state, but who has more responsibility right now than the three of them? They could work 24/7 and still not get everything that needs to be done and talk to everyone that they need to talk to. And yet they recognize the importance of, for the sake of our conversation, hitting the pause button, taking that time to rest. And I'm sure that it wasn't as restful I'm now projecting because I don't know, but there are different ways that we can do that.
And I'm living into that in a different way. I mean, we've talked about having routine and being able to live with something that we're familiar with every day, but where I've taken a pause isn't necessarily with rest or with meditation, but that I made a new commitment to myself, and every day I'm walking. But that's a time for me to set aside for my thinking and reflection, even while I'm exercising or walking. But that was not something I was doing before. It's something I've always said I needed to do, but I've taken the opportunity in this storm to get a new perspective on things and giving myself time to think about it. So that's another way of doing it, I think.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
How are you finding pause, Sarah? What's going on in the midst of this storm? Of how are you finding a way to pause?
Well, unlike the first example that I gave you, after that, so this was before the pandemic, but it's continued through this pandemic, that I make sure that I have a weekend. It's not always Saturday, Sunday, but I make sure that I have a weekend and that is happening. This is going to sound so simple. There's been something about music during this whole pandemic. Music has been able to name things for me that I haven't had the words to name. I think that's how I'd say it. And so I've been listening to more music than I normally do.
So those are a couple of ways in which we pause, as you were talking about faith or faithfulness in the midst of caring for ourselves. But there's some things that we also do that aren't always helpful. What's one of those things? Sarah, one of the ways that I've learned in regard to pausing is that I know that the image of storms in the water, that ships don't go into port, they go out into the deep. They go out farther out into the ocean and anchor and wait for the storms to pass by. So sometimes for me, it's moving out or moving to a place where I'm going deeper in my own thinking, reflection with Bible study or with prayer or with connecting with people who are meaningful to me so that I find some meaning and understanding of the feelings that I have. So instead of trying to deny the feelings or push them away, I'm trying to make sense of them and finding out how I can use them to help navigate the storm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And sometimes the opposite happens, right? Sometimes we offload what we're feeling instead of addressing what we're feeling, like you were just talking about. And so when we don't go out into the deep, when we don't push away, we can offload our emotions.
So how do we do that? What are some things that we do to offload emotions?
A couple of the ways that we offload our emotions. I'll give you 3 different examples. If you've ever pushed something down so far and inside of yourself, something has happened to you, and then all of a sudden someone says something innocent to you and you jump down their throat. And later you are thinking about it and you think, wait a second, my response there didn't match what was really going on. That's one way that we offload our emotions. It's not a healthy way to deal with our emotions. Another big one is we numb. And when we numb, we don't feel. And part of numbing is that we're numbing both the good emotions and the bad emotions. So before I go any farther, let me say this. We all numb. It can be with food. It can be with social media. It can be a Netflix binge. It can be with alcohol. It can even be with that wine of the month club. And so let me distinguish a couple of things here. There's a difference between finding real comfort and numbing. When you ate that box of chocolate because you didn't want to feel the hurt of a breakup, that's numbing. When you have 3 drinks of wine or something else so that you can go to sleep, which you won't go to sleep better, that's addiction. When you eat a chocolate dessert after having a long day at the office or from working from home, so you're making this dessert, that's finding comfort. At least for me, I would say that that's finding comfort. So you might enjoy something because you say, you know what? I want to enjoy a dessert with my family. I think there's a difference between saying, I want to enjoy something that may also distract us from something else that is bothering us in that moment, and saying, I need to not feel this right now. When we get to the point of needing to not feel it, and this is an addiction seminar, so I'm not going to go any farther with this, that's a sign that you're leading to addiction. So we all do it. Don't think that we don't do it, but it's one way that we can offload emotion, just not feel. And again, remember, it's not just the bad emotions that we're numbing, we're also numbing the good ones. Another one, and then we can move on. It's the opposite of the first example that I gave you, but it's also part of what we've been illustrating is you go and go and go so that you don't have to feel. And then your body shuts down in some way. I remember back when I was working at Miami, 2 or 3 Januaries in a row, I lost my voice. And I blamed it on the weather being cold, where I was living, that there wasn't, enough humidity and allergies. What I came to learn is it was stress. It was stress from a storm. It was the season that I was living through, and that was how my body was reacting. So now when I start to sense that my voice is going, right now my voice is kind of raspy because of allergies, but when I sense my voice is starting to go, that's a check for me to go, okay, Sarah, what needs to happen here? You need to hit the pause button and rest, because your body is starting to come to the point that your body's about to react because I've been going. That is a way that we offload emotion. We don't deal with it. Does that make sense?
It does. And I can identify with some of that, and even with people with whom I'm working now. One of the things, I'll say this for me, one of the things that I've grown through is that suppression and pushing it down. That used to be pretty normal for me. I don't think it's quite that way now. I mean, I haven't barked at you for a while. So one of them that I see, I identify it with myself, but I see it with the people around me, is the numbing. It's difficult in the midst of this storm for people to really name their emotions. And I think part of it is because if I'm projecting now, I think part of it is that if we name it, it may overcome us. So by not naming it, we're keeping it at arm's distance, which is actually the very opposite is happening. When we don't name it, it does take us over. But I think that's part of it. And where I've seen that, and maybe I'm going to go one step too far, is that in the kind of resources we've been doing, whether it's Bible study or podcast or blogs, if we start talking about feelings, we don't get a whole lot of response. And I'm saying I think that's because it's very difficult for us to name those things when it's so close. And when we can keep them at a distance, we can talk about them in theory. But when it becomes reality, it's really difficult for us. So I see that numbing piece at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it points to the bigger idea of, if we're going to be courageous leaders, the 4 skills that we need to be courageous, the first one's rumbling with vulnerability. And to rumble with vulnerability and then move into living our values, move into trust, move into learning to rise. Those are the 4 skills. We have to get comfortable with the language of emotion. And I think part of it you named, it's what we're going through right now. And if I can hold it at an arm's length distance, then if I don't name it, then I don't have to deal with it. I think the other thing, and I was reminded of this last week on a call with Brene Brown, that most adults don't have the language for emotion. We've never learned that. And so, while people may not be responding, my hope is that we are planting seeds and beginning to help people recognize the importance of it so that they can step into it.
Am I correct in saying that part of the work that you've been doing and helping in the midst of the storm, but part of the work with Dare to Lead is actually giving some language to this? Isn't that part of what you're doing? Yeah,
it absolutely is. That's why we're doing this series of episodes on leading through storms, is helping folks to do that. That's why we've done why I did the video Bible devotions. Yes, trying to help folks step into that. And it's the last thing that any of us want to do right now. And what I would say, and this is going to sound crass, I don't mean it to sound crass, is if we had done this work a year ago, 2 years ago, a lifetime ago, We wouldn't have to do it now when it feels harder. But we're not going to be able to lead through this storm and help other people get to the other side of this storm if we don't name our own emotions. And when we're tired, to go back to what we've been talking about on this episode, when we recognize that we're tired, when we recognize that our schedule has been go, 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 that we do take the time to rest, that we value that so much, and we value the rhythms that God has laid out for us, that we begin to practice that. It's going to feel uncomfortable when you start because you're going to think about all the things that aren't getting done. But we really wanted to stop by today and remind you that when we're in the midst of storms, our values and as a result, our behaviors and our emotions, they get magnified. And one way that we can address that is by pausing, resting, Sabbathing. I just created a word, I think. Call it whatever you will. And I say that knowing that the leaders who listen to this podcast, there are a million new things that you have to care for. And the dynamics are different at home and in your community and in the church. But our challenge to you today is to grab your calendar and to name a day right now that you're going to rest and care for yourself. Because if you can't care for yourself, you're not going to be able to care for others and lead others. And if you can't schedule a day, do a half day. And if you can't do a half day, then find 2 hours that you are resting. Before I continue down that, Tim, any last words that you want to offer for this episode?
Sarah, do you think it would be advisable for me to say that all of our listeners, every one of our listeners, has the agency, has the capacity to be able to make this decision for themselves? We can remind them, and we can give them resources to help do it, but they have to make this decision for themselves, and there's no one with whom they're working, whether that's supervisors or people that they're leading, that are going to say, you shouldn't do that. The only way you can be healthy is really to care for yourself. And that's what we're trying to remind you to do today.
That is it. And I'll leave you with this one. It just might be that when we don't rest, we're trying to play God. Because we think that we can handle it all.
So, Sarah, I think I'm going to go take a nap.
You can't yet. We've got one more episode to record. So before we leave you, let me remind you that you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/118. Now go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.